Thanks. All right, good morning, everyone, and thanks, Alan, for the invitation. So today I'm just going to give you a brief overview of a new Australian Research Council-funded project that aims to develop a new population projection model for Australia to try to be able to anticipate the impact of migration policy. So as you know, migration policy making is incredibly complex, and that's because migration affects so many aspects of our society. It impacts the future size and location of the population. It also determines the labor force supply and its skills composition, as well as the demand for goods and services, including housing. And so that means that any migration policy needs to carefully consider and anticipate impacts on these different dimensions in the short and longer term. But that's something incredibly difficult to do because it requires very detailed data and complex models. Now, as a demographer, I particularly like population projections, and we're very fortunate in Australia to have two Commonwealth agencies that produce such population projections, the Centre for Population at Treasury and the ABS. And they use cohort component models, which are aggregating models based on population count data, and they produce population projection by age, sex, and location, as well as migrant status. And so here's an example of such projections produced by the Australian Bureau of Statistics. You can see here the future size of the Australian population under different scenarios. And the one at the bottom in white is the size of the Australian population if we had gone to zero net overseas migration from 2022 and staying at this zero level. And you can see, unsurprisingly, the population would peaked in the late 2030s and then decline thereafter with obvious changes to the age structure, the labor force supply, the tax base, and so forth. Now, as you know, migration policy is much more than migration numbers. And in fact, the main policy instrument is visa. And so that's means that we probably need to integrate and put visa status in our population projections. Visa policies are really important because they influence the composition of our migrant population in terms of age and age structure and skills composition. We also know that visa conditions can have an impact on the labor force, whether we heard in Canada, for example, the spouse of students can no longer work. So there are other conditions as such that can impact the future of the labor force. And there may be other policy levers that the government want to intervene or use, like labor force participations. For example, there are some groups like humanitarian migrants or some secondary visa applicants from some countries that have low labor force participation. Maybe that's something that we want to work on in the future. But bottom line, if we want to have population projection that we can use to anticipate the impact of migration policy interventions, we need to have more characteristics in our population projections. We definitely need to have visa status. But there may be other characteristics that we want to have that could be labor force participation, employment status, educational attainment, and other characteristics that we may want to add to population projections if we want to understand the impact of migration policies and migration intakes on the future size of the population, but also on the labor force and on housing demand. Now, the challenge we're facing is that the traditional cohort component models, they're great, they work really well, but you cannot have too many characteristics in there because then you will need to cross-tabulate all these different variables. You end up with a large number of cells. It's very cumbersome, but more importantly, some of the cells become very small or empty, and statistically, that's a problem. So the solution we're proposing for this project is to move to a macro simulation-based population projection, which is based on individual level data. So instead, and what we can do it now is because we have PLIDA, the previous speaker talked about PLIDA, these administrative data sets linked to census. And why it's so interesting for us in that project is that we have the whole visa trajectory. Now, the way we're planning to run the project is to construct a synthetic population. So that's an individual level data set of people who do not exist, they're synthetic people, but they actually represent the population by different characteristics. Once we have this population, we can actually apply transition probabilities and make them go through a series of events every year and into the future. So I won't go into any technical details, but here's the plan. Once we have this population, we can see whether they're going to have a child next year, whether they'll die. We also will have a migration module so that people can enter and leave Australia. And then the novelty here is to introduce a visa module so that we can model and consider visa transition, so transition from different visa statuses and all the way to citizenship. We also want to have an education model to see how people evolve in the educational trajectory, because it's so important for the labor market to have education as well as a labor force module to see how people move in and out of the labor force and in and out of employment. And while we'll start with the national model, there is the option down the track to have an international migration module to have subnational estimates. And the aim, which is quite ambitious, I do recognize this, is to produce a population count to 2071, so to align with the ABS by different characteristics, including labor force status, visa status, and educational attainment. Now, this is interesting because then we can plug in what-if scenarios to start thinking, what if we do this, what's going to be happening in the short, medium, and longer terms. So here's an example of scenarios that we would like, we're hoping, to be able to test down the track once we have this model up and running. What would happen to the size of the population or the labor force if we cap international students' number versus increasing them to a particular target? Or what happens if we reduce the duration of post-graduation work rights for international students? And you can think of different, policy that relates to the actual visa, number of years to become citizens, or changing the annual permanent skill migration intake like they've done in Canada, which would have an impact on how many people could transition from temporary to permanent, and also how many people probably leave the country. We could also play with that model to think about the labor force participation of some groups. Now, the key advantage of micro-simulation-based population projections is that we can add variables to and information to the model without quite easily. So, for example, if I know somebody's age, visa status, citizenship status, educational attainment, labor force participation, we can estimate they're using external data, for example, from census, the probability of being in a particular household structure. And then you can append this to the existing model to then move on to a household level by then allocating people into different households to start thinking about the impact on housing demand, for example. Something we would like to do as well in these projects is to start thinking, when we think about labor force planning and population aging, can we go beyond simply age-based dependency ratios? Because we know that there are other variables that impact the labor force. And perhaps we can move towards productivity-weighted labor force dependency ratios by adding productivity modules. So for example, if we know all these variables in blue for people, we can attach to them probabilistically a wage, and we could use the wage as a proxy, for example, for productivity. And the idea here is that perhaps not only we could use this to do migration policy testing, but start thinking about policy trade-offs. So if we, again, thinking about the future of the labor force, yes, there is migration policy, but also we can improve, labor force participation and productivity through educational expansion. Well, if we do this in the future, how does it weigh up and compare to migration? Or if we increase labor market participation for some groups, we improve productivity, which is quite difficult to do, as we all know, or perhaps we delay retirement age. How does different policies, what the relative contribution to thinking about the future of the labor force under different migration scenarios? Now, as I said, that's a vision for the project. And I have to say, when Alan invited me to present, I actually declined the invitation at first because I thought how foolish of me to go and talk about a project that hasn't started, and then everybody will have expectations. And as you know, the reality is always much more difficult when you want to run your project. But I said, hey, why not? So the project is starting mid-next year. It's going to be running for 4 years, and it's funded, as I said, by the Australian Research Council. the Australian Research Council, we now are setting up the team and getting started on a few things for the project leading up to June next year. In the team, we also have Jean Wu, who's somewhere here in the audience, so you can go and ask her questions as well. She's a research fellow at UQ. We're currently recruiting a few PhD students. So again, if you have anyone in your team who'd like to join, we would be very happy because I mean, PhD scholarships are not that many going around these days. And we're also collaborating with CSA in Austria, particularly Dr. Marwa, who has developed similar projections for Europe and Canada. We see this as a collective endeavor, so we're really happy to, a collaborative endeavor. We're really happy to collaborate with anyone who has an interest in thinking about these different modules that feeds into population projection, or perhaps later down the track, thinking about assumptions, which assumptions would make sense, and also perhaps working collaboratively to think about scenarios and which kind of policies we'd like to test in the future. Thank you.
Lovely. Well, we're setting up. Thanks, like everyone else, thanks to Alan and the Migration Hub team for putting on today's great event and giving me the chance to talk. I really appreciate it. And by way of introduction, my name is Lachlan Bass. I'm a research manager at the E61 Institute, which is a not-for-profit, independent, non-partisan economic research institute. But I also do a PhD under Professor Brunig here. So it was really encouraging to hear him say data doesn't matter. It's easy. We just we'll just write. I'll just write the paper and send it to you tonight. But yeah, very excited. And Ord and Justin and I didn't get to meet before this, but actually their presentations have set up mine really well, very complimentary. So thanks to them as well. So Ord and Justin touched on the great microdata we have in Australia, particularly on the individual side in PLIDA. I want to talk a bit about the value of firm data and what it can help us understand in economic research around migration. And so often, a lot of research, at least in the economic sphere, focuses on individual characteristics of a migrant or the people around the migrant to kind of analyse their economic outcomes. And in the economic literature, there's been a lot of recent work looking at the role of the firm in people's outcomes in recent years, particularly around the gender pay gap, people's lost income from job loss, and things like inequality more broadly. And we often sometimes forget firms because they're a bit nebulous, but it's important to remember that firms are owned by people, they employ people, and they produce goods and services that people consume. And what they are is just an organisation that brings together capital, workers, and ideas to produce stuff. And some firms are better than that than others. And so then as a worker, the firm you work at might be important for the economic opportunity that you have in terms of not just wages, but also other factors to do with your employment. And so I want to talk a bit today about the value of understanding the role of the firm and firm data, the data we have in Australia, building off what Justin and Ord talked about, and then just give you a few examples of what you can do with it to try and kind of whet your appetite, inspire some potential ideas, and motivate you that it is interesting, as boring as talking about firms can sound. This is a disclaimer. I'm not going to make you read it all. That's what it says on the tin. Effectively, some of the data, the great data we have access to due to the ABS, they just make sure it's private, it's confidential, any errors in the work are my own, that kind of thing. And thanks to the ABS and Home Affairs and others for providing that data. So to motivate why I think understanding the role of the firm is interesting, I thought I'd highlight some really timely analysis by the OECD, which was released about 2 weeks ago in their annual migration outlook. There's a whole chapter dedicated to it, chapter 4, if you want to go look at it. And in that, what they do is they look at the differences between a migrant when they enter a host labour market to a non-migrant. They control for observable differences like age, gender, and education. And they look at that difference and try and decompose the differences into 4 factors. One is the region in which the migrant works. The second is the sector in which they work. The third is the firm within those regions and sectors. And the fourth thing is just the things they can't explain, so the within firm differences. So there's a lot of countries up here on the chart. I'd focus on the orange one. That's the OECD average for the countries that provided data. And so what it shows is there's around a 35% earnings gap between migrants and non-migrants who look similar in the first year that migrants are in the labour market in that host country. And of that 35%, around 2/3 of that earnings gap is due to the firm or the sector that firm works in. So that's the dark and middling dark orange line there. And the dark line itself, which is the firm effect, is about 1/4 of the earnings gap. And so that kind of motivates why we might want to care about the firms that these migrants are working at, because about 1/4 of the earnings gap is due to that. It's a great chapter. I'd highly recommend you go read it. They look at the changes over time and how much the firms contribute to those changes over time as well. So I feel like Justin and all would have set me up. We've had great advancements in Australian data recently. It allows us to do lots of great things. They've talked about the individual side, which we call PLIDA. There's great data on migrants, the visas they hold, when they hold them, if they're in the country, other country. It sounds like there's more coming, which is really exciting. There's data on people's income, their earnings, just their demographics, their education, lots of great data. And on the firm side, we can see the business tax data, which tells us how much revenue firms earn, how much money they spend on expenditure, their wage bill. We can use that to estimate things like the firm productivity. There's also other cool data like patent data to see how innovative those firms are, who owns those firms, these kind of things. And then you can link these two data sets together through worker information payroll data. And that allows us to really investigate lots of interesting questions and bring the firm into migrant research. And now a little example from my previous work where we've linked this data. So we look at the productivity of the firms that migrants work at and how this changes over time. This is a little bit older. I think Nick and the Treasury team have seen this before. So what we do is we calculate firm productivity at the firm level, and then we put each of those firms into 5 buckets, where firms in bucket 1 are in the lowest level of productivity and firms in bucket 5 are in the highest level of productivity. And then we link workers to visas to those firms, and we look at where those workers are working. And so for migrants, we calculate the share of them at each of those different quintiles, and same for non-migrants. And so what we can see here is non-migrants tend to be slightly more positively selected to higher productivity firms, not a large difference, but across the distribution, slightly more selected. And then we look at this change over time from 2011 to 2020, and we can see that for both migrants and non-migrant workers, the number that are working at higher productivity firms decreases across both. And that's consistent with the slowdown that we've seen in Australian productivity growth over the last couple of decades. That's a bit of a taste. The second thing we can do, which is really cool with the data, we can then look at that by broad visa categories or broad visa types. So we kind of made up our own categories here. We've got 2 main ones. One we call targeted, which is permanent skilled and temporary skilled migrant workers, where we kind of select through rules and things like that into giving them a visa. And then the second is students and working holiday makers. We call them less targeted, they're more demand driven, and they're on the bottom charts here. And we do the same thing. We look at the firms they work at in 2011. We look at the firms they work at in 2020. So probably 2 things you can kind of note from these charts is that decline that we saw in the previous slide. Again, we see that across all visa types. So there's something secular happening across the economy here. But the other interesting thing, particularly in the targeted group, but for temporary skilled migrants, we see them actually really positively selecting towards the higher productivity firms. So that might tell us there's something positive or something happening there in the mechanism about how these migrants are being chosen. That's all from me. I'm well under the 10 minutes. Just want to give you guys a sense of like what you can do with the data and why it's interesting, and hopefully that kind of whets people's appetites.
Since we have Julian Hill coming next, I do want to try to keep us on time, but I also want to have an opportunity to let people ask questions of the panel. Good questions end with a question mark, and good answers are short. And I want people in the back row to start. You people reliving your undergraduate experience sitting up there in the back row. Let's have a question from one of you to kick off. There we go.
Yeah, the migration outcomes data sounds very, very, very interesting. Bronwyn's nodding. She's a fellow migration agent. Just wondering, will that be backdated, or is that just something that you're collecting from this day forward? And how will that be available and when?
It's a data set that we're still working on internally with the Bureau. The plan, at this stage, it's an aspiration to be moving to making it more broadly available. So I don't know exactly when, but the part of the thing is how much effort we're able to put into actually getting it to that point. And if we know that there is really strong interests, then that just helps us to justify taking people off other projects to be working on making it available more quickly. So part of my purpose today is really just to kind of try and gauge how much appetite there is. So please, let's chat later on. But yeah, so it probably some time off, but yeah, that'll be partly driven by the extent of interest.
There's a question up in the back here.
Thank you. My name is Henry. A question for Ord. That looks like a fantastically ambitious project, which I think is exactly what we should want out of sort of policy-based academic research. I guess the biggest thing that strikes me is how are you going, like a lot of the individual characteristics, which Lachlan said, you can pull out a plighter and stuff like that. When you think about the really difficult trade-offs in migration policy and the uncertainty of migration policy, when you have a change in policy and those feedback loops are so quick, such as like, you know, a vet provider stops delivering carpentry and starts doing cookery over a 2-week period because the visa rules changed and they've stripped out their shop and they've changed their whole business model. How, I guess, will your model react to the changes in migration policy, which fundamentally change, I guess, the incentives of people if their main goal is permanent residency coming out of a temporary based arrival system?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think with modeling, it's always kind of a trade-off between feasibility and how much you put in there. And so, for example, you know, the specific example you've given, we won't go down specifically to industry or employment or stuff like this. We on purpose have decided to leave this away and leave this out. And I think, you know, we'd be looking only at limited policy levers, you know, visa, the types of visa, the number of visas granted and transitions between visas. But I guess some of the point you're making, you know, about alternative pathways, for example, we could, you know, perhaps you can, because we have data going back to 2006, if we can find historical and, you know, precedent, then we can know how people react, then we can think about the future, how, you know, then we could perhaps put it in. But yes, I'm very happy to keep these discussions with you because that's quite complex. And I have to say, because there's so many elements to it, I think we're going to start very simple and then build on gradually. But that's a very good point.
Ode, I want to ask a quick follow-up question on that. Do you imagine producing some kind of publicly available tool that people could use? Like, you know, Parliamentary Budget Office has the build your own budget. You could have a build your own migration program that people could, journalists and citizens could use. No, it's just, it might be useful for debate, right?
I mean, that's a long-term goal, you know what, and because I agree 100%, and all the discussion we've been having, you know, this morning is a problem we need to have, you know, we're having a debate, but we need to debunk some of the myth and have the information out there. So I agree 100%. That's, you know, the aim down the track is to have this online simulator where people can select some variables, you know, migration numbers and different visas and see how it fits in. So that, you know, it's not only us who have access, but it's available more broadly. But, you know, you're probably going to have to wait until 2030.
Okay. I had a question from Mark Cully and then the woman here. So Mark first.
Thanks, Bob. I have a question, it's a bit of a follow-on from Henry's to Ord, and it ties in with some of Nick's observations as well, which is maybe a useful first step would be if your research team could produce a document assessing the utility of population projections and how they've been done at a time. I worry about a horizon that goes out to 2071, I think it was. If I go back 50 years, the White Australia policy just ended. We didn't have a points test for skilled migration. We didn't have a refugee program in formal sense. That didn't start until 1979. Tremendous amount of changes. And then the other observation I'd make is, why do we keep getting population projections so wrong? Both Treasury and the ABS. And I think fundamentally we do not understand and don't try to model the drivers of migration flows. I don't know how you model labour demand. That's always been very difficult to do, but the biggest driver of migration flows in and out of Australia has been labour demand differences, and then you add on some chain migration effects. And so I just really wonder about how helpful. I can understand the scenario stuff is helpful, but just the population projection stuff just really kind of concerns me as a guide for doing policy if we don't fundamentally get to this issue of what drives migration flows.
Thanks.
That may have been a comment, but you can have a quick answer to that.
Very quick answer. I think the role of population projections is really to think about, and particularly when you bring in the scenarios, is to think about alternative possible futures. And I don't think the aim, here, particularly the aim is not to tell you, there are going to be that many people in that. It's thinking, if we propose this policy change, we can think if we keep the other, for example, variable stable, what the impact will be. So I don't think it's about, predicting the future. It's about thinking about impacts. Yeah.
Okay, I had two questions in the middle here, the third row. The woman here in the middle.
Thanks very much for a fantastic presentation, the three of you. And I've got a question around temporary migration data and understanding the impact of temporary migration in Australia and whether the department is looking. I understand using PLIDA, you can see where temporary migrants are distributed, but that's a lot of work. And you have to have highly specialised migration modelling and access to PLIDA data. So the question is around, is the department looking at collecting temporary migration locational data, not just on entry, but where temporary migrants are moving, so we can all understand the various roles and impacts that temporary migrants are having?
I was going to say, I agree that it'd be really, really nice data to have. It's really hard to get in practice. We've looked at students, because at the universities often have where they are, but working holiday makers are just constantly, on the move. Visitors are constantly on the move. We see, we know that a lot of them will put their first night's accommodation down as their destination on their incoming passenger cards. If there's an easy way to kind of solve that problem, short of putting a GPS tracker or an air tag on each of them, I'd really love to hear it, because it's something that we'd love to be able to do, because it would be really valuable from a research perspective. But it's just something that they don't touch government. We don't have an obligation on people to report where they are, and it'd be a massive administrative burden if we did. So, but yes, I agree. But how would we do it practically? If you've got ideas, love to hear them. Okay.
And what salary I have. Just three simple questions as part of the user requirement to collect that data.
Look, these things are possible. I think these cohorts change. They can change jobs from one, very, very quickly. But there are things. We track that sort of thing through CSAM for the permanent migrant cohort. Take your suggestion on board. But
Okay, so I think I had the gentleman in the white hair here. That's fine. I'm going to just put you on hold for a second. The woman here then.
Sure, thank you. It's somewhat related, so it's a nice segue. Hayley Henderson from the Crawford School here as well. I am also interested in this locational question, and all day we've heard about the relationship in the debates and media around housing and migration, and I'm just wondering, the two developments in the research and also in the policy space that you've spoken to in terms of statistics, what sort of what might we expect in those spaces that link migration outcomes in terms of housing and migration going forward?
Well, I know that colleagues in other parts of government are looking at some of these questions, but yeah, we haven't. It's not something that we've done within Home Affairs yet, but yeah, certainly Treasury have a keen interest in it. And yeah, I think there is this question of where are people? Currently, we have the census as the snapshot, but this is where once we get MLO fully up and running, and try and see to what extent do they touch, if students are touching other pieces of government, and we can actually map that. We're just not at the point with the development of the MLO data set yet to be able to test how good that is.
Sorry, Bob, can I
Yeah,
jump in?
Lachlan.
The other thing, so at E61, we use a lot of private sector data sets. So on the last question and the one before that, there's only so far the admin data will be able to get us by definition, unless we become like a surveillance state, which I think most people would probably not want to be. And so we need to be innovative in how we kind of try and find out this information. So for example, you could use spending data sets or property sales/rental data sets to get a better understanding of where some of these people are living or spending their time. So I think a bit of thinking outside the box might be helpful. They're expensive and time consuming, so there's trade-offs.
So possession is 9/10 of the law. This gentleman has the mic, so I'm going to let him ask a question, and then I'm going to come to you afterwards. Yep.
Thanks very much for that. Chris Carman from Work Initiatives might be able to help you a bit with the data. We're building the jobs and skills platforms for industry. We're actually just about to roll out about 160 location-based platforms that are given away to the community. It's actually based on the work that the member and Assistant Minister Julian Hill did around the overhaul of the employment services. So it segues quite well into your conversation that you're going to have. But my question is that obviously data is so important for every single decision that we make. It doesn't matter whether it's government, whether it's industry, whether it's policy makers, whether it's individuals. My question for each one of you is, if you could have data that you don't have to reach your goal, what would that be?
Lachlan, do you want to go first and then Odd and then Justin?
Yeah, I think it's related to the location data. Linking in private sector data like consumption patterns, I think would be super useful, because we can see incomes of migrants in the administrative data, but we can't see what really matters, which is their consumption and how they're living and what they're doing.
I'd say actually, I think we're in a very unique position now, with PLIDA and the immense amount of work the ABS has done, and the fact that they keep on improving capabilities and adding modules and refining the data set. I think we're in an unprecedented, situation. There's huge opportunities here in Australia. Maybe we're not as where Scandinavia is, but perhaps we're going to catch up with them very soon. So I think there is so much data and so much support from the ABS that I think we can do a lot of things right now with what we've got.
And I think, look, my focus very much is at the moment is making sure that what we've got is actually robust and protecting the quality of it. It's really easy for things to go wrong and to go wrong at scale. And as we get AI, that data quality is critical. So I think, I agree, we want to be aspiring to do more, but also making sure what we've got is sound.
I think our data is actually better than the Scandinavian data in many ways. And the thing I would like to know, so with the migrants, I can see them really well when they work in the tax data. But if they're not working, I have a hard time seeing them because they're often not touching the social security system. So something about the activity of the people that aren't working would be, I think, really useful to understand what's going on. I'm not on the panel, but I'm going to chip in with my with my desires. Yes, please, here at the gentleman here.
Your question for Ord. I was intrigued that one of the variables that you picked for your future studies was looking at the impact of lengthening the residential qualifying period for citizenship. I was just wondering why you didn't pick shortening the residential qualifying period for citizenship, because it has actually been much shorter in the past.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And I was thinking we could use these historical changes from 2 to 4 and 5 years to see what it's actually done. But when you hear about the public debate, I don't think there is any appetite to shorten it. And I think if anything, then also looking at what's happening in other countries, it may be moving the other way. But again, you know, we can try what we want to test. But yeah, point taken, very happy to try it that way.
We have time for one more question if they're up here.
Thanks, panel. These conversations about data, they tend to get quite complex at times. And I think the reality is that we leave people behind in these conversations because they simply cannot follow and keep up with the numbers and the graphs. And for me, that's where I think a lot of people start to make uninformed or have uninformed viewpoints, particularly about things like migration. Do you think, in addition to all of this, that there is a role for you guys as academics and senior government officials to dumb it back down and to display the data in a way that is accessible to everyone, such that people can make these informed decisions and have informed viewpoints about migration?
Lachlan, do you want to?
Yeah. So everything
Swing at that first.
everything I've done is publicly available. Ooh, very loud. Not nice hearing your own voice. Yeah, I agree. Everything I've done is publicly available. Could we do more to make it like more accessible? Definitely. You know, I don't want to speak for Ord or Bob, but I know Alan does a lot, you know, working with people in the media to help them understand the numbers they're looking at, and I do that as well. So I think we feel that obligation. Yeah, definitely. Just because you don't see it publicly doesn't mean it's not occurring.
Ord, do you have?
Yeah, very briefly, look, I agree. And I think, for example, a website like the Conversation, I think and we try to do more. It's time consuming, but we try to do it. I think that's a great way. And actually, each time I submit an article, they tell me, oh gosh, this is way too complicated. So we keep on simplifying it. And the journalists are very good at telling us actually how to communicate. And then we reach a point that, you know, seems to be useful for the public. But I think you're right, we're probably not doing more of it. So we'll take this on board.
I think it's something academics traditionally aren't very good at, right? They write very complicated things and they expect people to come flocking to them, right? I think producing things in ways that are very accessible to journalists and policymakers is really important. I mean, E61 does a lot of that. Tax and Transfer Policy Institute does a lot of that. So I think we need more people doing that. So that's a good call out. Join me in thanking all of the speakers. We're going to finish on time because, as they say in the Air Force, if you're late, you bomb the wrong village. So thank you.